Honored guests, honored guests, please do take a seat. I know it's been a long day. We have the best at the end, so I urge all of you to please find your seats again now that you stretched your legs so that we can get started. Hugo, the floor is yours.
Can everybody hear me? Yes, okay, great. So every year at the Vienna Migration Conference, we try and do a panel at the end of the day that has very little to do with migration. And the reasoning behind that is to give you all a break from what has been a very intense, but I think extremely rewarding day of discussions. And at least for the brief time that I've been in ICMPD, my name is Hugo Brady, I'm a senior strategic advisor here. I've been here for around 4 years now, it's hard to believe. That this is maybe one of the best VMCs that I have been at, and I hope you all feel the same. And congratulations to Sedev on her excellent panel just before. We call this panel at the end of the day the geopolitical panel, and a couple of years ago we started this format because it was becoming increasingly clear that migration is also a geopolitical issue. Now, we haven't, I don't think, found the language yet to frame it in properly geopolitical terms, but you have, for example, at the moment, on both sides of the Atlantic, Europe and America experiencing an asylum crisis at the exact same time, as you have an unprecedented migration to the rich world happening over the last year post-pandemic. So, migration is a geopolitical issue, but we haven't figured out exactly how to speak about it that way. Turning now for a minute about what do we mean about geopolitical Europe? Well, it's very simple. Just like migration, geopolitics refers to our ability to influence the world around us, or the ability of the world to influence us. And Europe is this, the von der Leyen Commission came into office a couple of years ago, styling itself as the Geopolitical Commission. And we often, today I have heard the word many times, geopolitics, geopolitical imperative, geopolitical priority. So I can see this word is increasingly at the center of all our minds. And Europe must engage more skillfully geopolitically, not just on migration, but on so many issues today, if it wants to strike forward with confidence into the future. There's no more geopolitical act than Europe can do, but to enlarge itself. And that is when Europe is at its most geopolitically well-endowed, its most geopolitically potent, because it is the greatest way that Europe can influence the world around it, by transforming the world around it through mutual consent into what we would call a space of common European values. And for the very first time, enlarging the EU has become a subject which we can once again speak about with confidence. It has actually gone from something that felt a bit, in previous conferences here, it felt a bit embarrassing to speak about enlargement because we were suffering from an enlargement pause. Now, with the invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine is very much at the heart of the discussion because it has reignited the idea of enlargement. In February 2022, suddenly we find ourselves looking at the prospect of the European Union enlarging to perhaps even as many as 36 members. But how can that be possible? Because at the moment we have even people, for example, the French were traditionally skeptical about enlarging the EU, always believing that you must deepen the EU if you want to enlarge it. So there has always been this trade-off. But suddenly now President Macron has become a convert to this idea. You have the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, saying, we will enlarge the EU by 2030. You have very strong rhetoric also from the President of the Commission. So suddenly enlargement is a viable dream again. And my question that I want to pose with my fellow colleagues here tonight is, perhaps are we getting ahead of ourselves, or is this a realizable dream? And to tease out the details of this discussion, I could not be joined by two better people. The problem is that they are my friends, so I'm definitely going to make a mess of this panel, because it's always like that. But anyway, on my right-hand side, I'm really honored to be joined by Jana Kobzova. She is the foreign policy advisor to President Kobzova, the president of Slovakia. And Jana, her CV is so extraordinarily impressive, so I will have to abbreviate it a little bit. Jana was, for many, many years, one of the most respected observer activist, I would label you, especially as regards the post-Soviet space in which you did made a major contribution to the working and advancing for the democratization of that space. Later on, you became program director at Rasmus and Global. Your connections to, contacts in, engagement with Ukraine is unrivaled, in my opinion. And of course, I know that you're here against your will because I asked you to and begged you to. And also, you're here at a very difficult time because there was literally an earthquake in Slovakia yesterday. And your boss is busy at the moment trying to go through the process of ensuring that Slovakia has a government, a functioning government, in the next couple of weeks. And I think a decision on that might be imminent. But I want to really thank you personally, Jana, for being here today, and to apologize for you as well.
Thank you for the invitation.
Sorry for having to bring you. On my left is, well, it's very difficult for me to summarize Luuk, but he is a political philosopher and historian. He was my most honored predecessor as speechwriter to Herman Van Rompuy in the European Council, which means he spent 5 years and approximately 100 European summits in the company of presidents and prime ministers, I can't describe the level of work that Luuk put in to creating this idea that there should always be an intellectual in a position of high influence in the European Council. And you did so much to give substance to the European idea over the last 20 years, not least also through your very, very well noted books, The Passage to Europe, Alarms and Excursions, which was about the innovative period that the EU went through, from the migration crisis to Brexit, through Trump, through all of these different quote-unquote crises that the Union faced during that time. And you also most recently published a book called Pandemonium, which is about the EU's response to the COVID crisis. But we forbid you to write any more books because it's much too hard. And now you are as if you were looking for another challenge, you are the founder and director of the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics. So since we are talking about the enlargement of the EU, that is abbreviated as Big Europe, which always makes me smile.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, Luuk. Most welcome. The rhetoric around enlargement, let's begin with this. The rhetoric around enlargement has become so ambitious, you know. Annalisa Baerbock came out the other day and said, we will enlarge the Union from Lisbon to Luhansk. You have this very, very high soaring rhetoric. And I want to ask both of you, sort of as an opening, are these expectations realistic in your minds? Are they something that we can, I hope that it will not go into another cycle like it did for the Western Balkan countries, where originally there was much fanfare at the beginning, and then the process slowed down until it became almost sluggish. But Jana, I would like to start with you, because Ukraine is at the very center of the debate, to try and take us into the current situation in Ukraine as a way to get us started about the enlargement debate. And then I will go over to Luuk, and we will talk about the complexities of bringing Ukraine into the Union. But just what are we facing on the ground in Ukraine at present? Can Ukraine win this war?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Hugo. And you're being, as always, very, very kind in your introductions. And I take it that you say that because I'm your friend. But thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you here today. Thank you for coming with the most difficult questions in the beginning. I'll start with the situation, and then I'll go to the choices ahead. The situation militarily is basically we are in month 20 of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think when it comes to military progress, Ukraine is in a much better shape than many had thought it would be in the first days of invasion. In those 20 months, they've managed to gain back 50% of the territory previously occupied by Russia. So there is progress, but of course, the current counteroffensive, which you've probably seen a lot of headlines about, is progressing. It's progressing very slowly at incremental pace, which is of course in contrast with the kind of swift takes that Ukraine was able to do last year. Which of course provokes questions about how long this is going to go for, how much of a support Ukraine needs, is this a long war we all need to be ready for? And I will answer some of those questions in a moment, but I also want to bring back the political situation in Ukraine and the relations with the EU. If we were sitting here in September, October 2021, and you tell me Ukraine is going to be a candidate country to enter the EU, that we are now, or the Commission, the European Commission is now completing an assessment of whether it would recommend launching the enlargement or the accession talks with Ukraine. Most of you, and myself including, I would love. And this is where we are. Ukraine is as close to the EU as it has ever been. It's never been as close. And the same for NATO, which for a number of countries, including for part of the society in Ukraine for a long time, had been an unimaginable, that's a difficult word to say, situation. So this is what the situation is. The choices ahead, you've asked whether Ukraine can win. I think the answer on the Ukrainian side is very clear. They don't have any other choice. If you define as winning, regaining back its territory and defending its people, that's what they're doing. It's not like they can now decide that they'll go somewhere else, pack their stuff and leave the country to Putin. The choice is for us to make. It's no secret that Ukraine depends on support from other countries when it comes to its military effort, its fiscal situation, its humanitarian needs, whether we are able to help them cover it. And that is something that I think also in the light of where the counteroffensive is taking place and how it's going is something that is being discussed. I think the choice is very clear. The odds of Ukraine losing this war and Russia controlling all of Ukraine would be a catastrophe for the rest of the European Union. Irrespective of the Ukraine itself and something that would of course create a huge catastrophe within Ukraine. But the downsides of that scenario is such that I think we also do not really have a choice but continue this cooperation, the support. The ways how we do it in a way that doesn't turn against Ukraine, the public that we have in the European Union, and how we do it smartly so we don't exhaust ourselves to the point that we are not able to help Ukraine.
I mean, let me just ask you a small filler add-on question, which is Ivan Krastev, our colleague and friend, he posited that the natural deadline for the war to end is actually the US presidential election next year. I mean, how do you react to that statement?
I'm not sure that Putin has those deadlines.
Yes. But it will be a long war, fundamentally. We all know that. It's not going to resolve itself before, anytime soon, certainly not before next summer.
That's a realistic expectation. The question is, there are a lot of things that you cannot predict. The one question I would personally have is Russia's ability to withstand this economically, its ability to produce weapons that are shipped and they're able to get them to the front line, and how much of the morale they can sustain with their own troops who are seeing that they're dragged into a war they didn't want. They don't want to be part of it. They were forced. Many of them are there because they're forced. So those are questions that can, of course, influence that.
All of that was very, very real and immediate a few months ago, but we were all waiting for the effect of the extra armaments to reach Ukraine and be deployed. And I guess, is it still a matter of training time and getting these weapons out into the field, or have we already seen the main impact of, for example, fighter jets are supposed to be delivered to Ukraine, and we haven't seen the effect of that yet at all?
Very few were delivered in the first place. We're talking about, I think, 15 or 16 cases altogether, and this is mainly coming from Poland and Slovakia. These are old fighter jets. These are not new fighter jets that Ukraine is calling for. That's one thing. You have to appreciate the military situation on the ground. Ukrainians are making gains in a situation which no Western army would actually want to get involved in. In terms of it's the most heavily mined territory on Earth at the moment. And they're proceeding with their counteroffensive in a situation when they have no air superiority. That's a scenario that none of the NATO countries would ever want to be involved in.
And then as regards enlargement, we're looking forward to even a possible decision to open talks in December, as soon as December. And against the background of the need to maintain hope, this promise of enlargement is this real geopolitical imperative. But of course, the country is in no way in good shape to be going through such a rigorous process. Luuk, you've already started doing some of the thinking in big Europe about the questions that are facing not only Ukraine but also the EU, because if we complete the enlargement to 36 members, we will have taken 70 million people inside the Union. So it's not a small thing. And I was also struck this morning by a lot of our migration in the last couple of years, certainly after the 2004 enlargements, were intra-European migrations. The European Commission would not like you if you said that, because they're all European citizens. But fundamentally, it was felt like this. And now we are, and one of the disturbing things for me about Putin's war is that he actually wants Ukraine's people for geopolitical reasons as much almost as the territory. But for the Union itself, all of this, we are talking the geopolitical talk, but in terms of actually making enlargement a reality, I think people are saying, well, we wish for the best, and we make the positive journey, but there's big questions on the horizon for the Union if it was to take in such a large population, new number of countries at once.
Yes, absolutely, Hugo. And first of all, thank you for your kind invitation and generous words. Very happy to be here in the center of Europe to talk about East and West. I think the questions you ask is a bit where the debate is now. A year ago, 3 months or so, 4 months into the war, Ukraine was granted EU candidate status. That was a historic decision, June 2022, taken by EU leaders, all 27 presidents and prime ministers, including, as you mentioned rightly, President Macron of France, who was always very reluctant and who made this move and understood that this was now a geostrategic necessity for the Union to open itself to Ukraine. So it's one of the ways, I think, before getting into the mechanics of enlargement, zooming out very briefly, it's one of the ways the EU is helping Ukraine. This morning we discussed a temporary protection mechanism, for instance. There's been humanitarian and military assistance. All these are efforts to help Ukraine sustain the war effort. But EU accession is a different story. It is about giving Ukraine a new place in the new continental order that has to be readjusted after the war. Because Ukraine, of course, was for 20 or 20 more years in this very uncomfortable place of being in between Russia and Europe, or Russia and the West, kind of gray zone or buffer zone, or you're not even allowed to use those words, but it was more or less that. Well, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that kind of in-between space does no longer exist. And we now want, that is the decision the EU has taken, Ukraine on this side of the new hard border that cuts across Europe, and on the other side of which we only have Russia and Belarus, basically. So that is a fundamental strategic decision which is shared, I think, by political leaders across the EU and also by Ukrainian leadership and people, clearly. There's a strong commitment. But that commitment has not been tested democratically on the side of member state governments, electorates in the rest of Europe. I think there has been a massive solidarity with Ukraine, refugees and financial and other military support. But that is still something else than accepting Ukraine as a member of the club with all what it entails. And that brings me to where we are now. A year ago, this was kind of a promise, opening the door. It was kind of, well, one day they will become member. It was not very concrete. But you know, from one VMC to another, every year is a year later, and the future is getting closer every day. And so Ukraine and other candidate countries are becoming impatient, and rightly so. So it is finally now, as Jana says, 20 months into the war, that it starts dawning upon leaders and electorates, okay, Ukraine will one day, in all likelihood, be a member. What does it actually mean? Well, it's massive, it's monumental, what it means for the shifts of power within the EU, what it means for issues of money, issues of security, rule of law. And it's now the moment where leaders discussed this last week in Granada at the EU summit. They, for the first time, actually start grappling with it. Yeah,
I think we see the fragility of that in the grain, in the argument over the summary ban on Ukrainian grain. EU gave Ukrainian access to the single market for its grain as a very relevant form of solidarity for a super competitive agricultural sector. And then the very countries that are the biggest backers of Ukraine, suddenly realize, that there's an impact here domestically for us, politically. And I think, if this is tested now, in a couple of years' time, when, how will Polish farmers react in 2030? Let's say it like that, for argument's sake. Ukraine is about to join the club. And my political awakening came with the Irish rejection of the Nice Treaty in 2001. I was not really aware of the EU up until this point, so we have that Nice Treaty to thank for my getting involved in EU affairs. But I remember, and I remember the argument was made to us at the time, how can you vote down a treaty that is designed to prepare the Union for enlargement to the Central and Eastern European countries? This is their historic dream. It's been something that's been worked on since 1989. And you were also let into the club, and when you were poor, and now you're getting richer and you're being selfish. So I can just imagine, Luuk, you're from the Netherlands. The Netherlands held a referendum on the DCFTA, which is nothing near EU membership, and it was voted down. So I think your paper, and it makes a very good point, is do not underestimate popular support. Diplomatic support, political support will be very high, but that doesn't mean that it will get it across the line. And what I don't quite understand, and I don't know if either of you have an answer, is Sarkozy made a change into the French law, or perhaps even the constitution, that says for certain enlargements there will have to be a referendum.
Yeah, well, I think there was even a bit earlier. There's going to, in principle, there has to be a referendum on EU enlargement in France. Constitutional, it means that's a constitutional requirement, unless 3/5 of both chambers vote against such a referendum.
Right.
But that's a pretty rough threshold to pass. I would say if Macron would ask the question today to his Assemblée Générale and his Senate, I would say bon courage. I mean, that's hard to win. So you might end up with a referendum or not, but it's quite a big threshold, and that makes it this whole enterprise, this road to Ukrainian membership. There's homework on the side of Ukraine and other candidate countries. There's homework on the side of the EU, but also at the end of the road, there is the electorates, and so that road is going to be long and windy and steep, and I hope we will get there, but we should not underestimate it. And I think what is important, that political leaders as of today take that into account, and also do the homework and the internal reforms of the EU, including with a view to certain concerns of their electorates, be it in Poland or Slovakia or in the Netherlands, France, and Belgium, the countries where I have lived in my life.
Yes, well, in my experience, referendums are just never a good idea in this respect. In fact, I remember in the 2001 referendum, a British colleague saying to me, "Why did the Irish vote down the Nice Treaty?" But then I got my revenge in 2016, obviously, to all our detriment. But anyway, even on the idea of popular opinion backing Ukrainian, we all know that on the day of a referendum, anything can happen. I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the Commission, came out this week, and I am not endorsing his words, but he said Ukraine can't join the EU; it's too corrupt. So you see, you're going to hear very big political voices around nearer the time who carry a lot of weight.
Well, I think the issue here is, and you mentioned also another leading EU politician, Charles Michel, who came forward with this date of 2030 as a kind of deadline, a kind of rallying point for both sides to be ready for the EU to enlarge. And I think such a deadline, it makes sense, because it can mobilize energy, both of civil societies and of government apparatuses. But there's also, in a way, a thin line between giving hope and false promises. So, and I think that is one of the challenges, one of the most difficult challenges, and we have to be honest about it, is about expectation management and a mismatch also in views. On the one hand, in particular in Ukraine, where the Prime Minister came out a few weeks ago saying that his country would be ready in 2 years. And on the other side, I think, well, you mentioned, would Ukraine be a member of the EU in 10 years? Maybe. Maybe not. For me, it would be like, I think Probably more than half a chance that it will be member, but not 100%.
You've described it as necessary but impossible, and I think Jana would describe it as impossible but necessary.
Yes. Yeah, but I think, I mean, one thing that we maybe keep forgetting is we are looking through the optics of today to an event that will happen in the future. And as if something that we are not in control of, we are in control of this, both on the Ukrainian side and on the European side. We know what the downsides and the issues with the previous enlargements were. And I think we need to have an honest conversation within the European Union about what needs to change if we are to expand. And of course, a Ukraine that is going to join the European Union is going to be a very different Ukraine than we see now. That's an absolute must. And I think if anyone, the Ukrainian leadership understands that. As for the comment from Mr. Juncker, I would just advise him to visit Ukraine. I don't think he's been there for a long time. I think, you know, it's one thing to, and I want to appreciate that because it hasn't been very obvious. If you look at the decisions the EU has made and the EU member states have made on Ukraine over the past 20 months, there are a few things you can criticize. You know, we've done the right thing when it comes to standing on the right side of history, defending the international order, UN Charter, helping Ukraine defend itself, sending the right political signals. As we speak, you know, you asked about Ukraine fatigue. As we speak, part of the Commission is drafting the assessment of how far they've gone on their reforms, and part of them is drafting a 50 billion check for another 4 years for reconstruction and budgetary support. So there are things we've done right. And I think what Luuk is saying, and it's really important to keep it in mind, we need to carry public with us, and I think the grain issue is something that we can learn from. Because the decision, for those of you who haven't followed, I mean, Ukraine had for a long time huge quotas on what they can import to the European Union, and last year to help them with their financial situation and with their exports, because Russia has blocked the Black Sea, they dropped it. The Commission has dropped all the restrictions, but a lot of that grain that was always targeted for countries outside of Europe ended up in Central and Eastern European markets. And I think we can learn from that. We've done the right decisions without really thinking through what the consequences are going to be and without taking a hard look at what the mitigation measures could be. And these are things we have done in the previous enlargements. You know, when the countries joined in 2004, there were labor market restrictions for 7 years in 12 countries, if I remember. Agricultural products were restricted and so on and so on. So there are things we can do. It just means that once we take the decision that this should be possible, once Ukraine is ready and we are ready, we really need to do a hard homework of making sure that this doesn't harm anyone, us or the Ukrainians, more than it's going to do help.
Well, we saw what happened in the case of Britain, and it was arguably catastrophic that more safeguards weren't, and it was very fateful for the EU.
Yeah, because at the time there were 15 members, and indeed 12 took these safeguard measures, but 3 didn't, including the UK, and they seem to have regretted it afterwards. And this is, as you said earlier, Hugo, where these issues of free movement within the EU, as it is officially called, of course, is perceived by public opinions, especially the west of the continent, as migration. Because people, let's say in Belgium or Portugal, when they have somebody, they don't make a difference between let's say internal EU migration or people coming from further afield, and this can.
We're not going to get into it tonight because we don't have time. But when I face the issue that many of us have had discussed in migration circles is why did Europe let in 5 million Ukrainians but didn't show the same generosity to other nationalities, etc. I often say back to them, we often don't treat Europeans very well either. You know, I mean, there's a colleague of mine here tonight dealing with the abuses of workers, Romanian workers in the Netherlands, for example. Ivan Krastev also says it's basically science fiction that we can get there by 2030 with any of the current candidate countries. But I want to take out confront the elephant in the room. This has been a phrase we used 2 or 3 times today at this conference. So confront the elephant in the room, which is that one reason for enlargement skepticism is, should we be really enlarging when the Union is so clearly divided on rule of law, arguments over the judiciary, countries blocking things, sanctions being blocked, critical foreign policy decisions held hostage, this is the question that is going to get asked by, you're not thinking about the consequences. Look at the experiences of the last couple of years. We're not united. We're not in a position to enlarge the family. So I like the fact that your paper made quite a few moderate, this is really a debate for the next commission, the next legislature. But you were already signposting a few things that could be done to mitigate things.
Well, I think that's also why we say strategically necessary and politically impossible, at least today, because there's conflicts and tensions. If tomorrow the EU would consist of 35, 36 member states, it would lead to a complete loss of cohesion. You would have all concerns about finances, decision-making capacity, and all of that. So there is a lot of work to do there to address some of these things. About the elephant in the room, if you want to call it that way, there's another elephant in the room on every panel probably, but maybe on this panel it is the rule of law. I think there a concern in many capitals and in Brussels is that there is also there a lesson to be drawn from the previous enlargement, the 2004 enlargement. Because the EU has learned in that process that when it comes to making sure that candidate countries are thriving democracies and have rule of law, independent judiciary, all of that, the EU has in fact more power over them when they are candidates than once they have crossed the threshold and are inside. And this is what we have seen after their accession, particularly in Hungary and in Poland. And so, of course, it's very unfair. Let's be honest, it's very unfair to think today that something like that might happen, let's say, with Serbia, which is one of the Western Balkan candidates. On the other hand, it would also be, I think, imprudent or almost irresponsible for the European Union not to think about the option and to reflect, okay, what can we do to avoid the repetition? Also because, again, public opinion would not understand it. The second time, you cannot say that you hadn't seen it coming.
Well, there was definitely a shift in public opinion on enlargement after the Romanian and Bulgarian accessions in particular. But Jana, can you offer us, when you're looking now back and you've been working in this area for a long time, in your generation, is there a shift? Are we baby boomers? I don't know. Is there a shift towards Europe in Central and Eastern Europe? Is that generation about to take power, as it were, and therefore there will be more convergence between East and West over time? There's already been so much economic convergence, it would make a lot of sense if there was, if we saw political convergence.
Yeah.
Or are we diverging, really?
I don't think we're diverging. I think you're right about the generational change. The generation in our region that has brought our countries to the European Union had a almost romantic, but I don't mean it in this messy way. It was a civilizational choice to go back to the European Union. Milan Kundera called our region the kidnapped West, and finally, with the enlargement, we came back. But we came without really understanding how the EU works, how we kind of find a new place within that community. We had our own ideas about how the EU should be working, and we're trying to find out whether that's how it should work for us. And I think the generation that is coming of age now and coming to power positions soon is a generation that feels completely at home in the European Union. It's for generation of my parents, Central Europe or Czechoslovakia was their home. For generation of my son, it's going to be the EU. The EU is our oyster, as you'd say. This is our civilizational and interactional space. This is where we want to be. The question, I think, a lot of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, some more successful than others, is how do you navigate in the European Union? It's not just a nice club where we share the same values. It's also a club where you still need to defend your national interests. How do you build alliances? How you shape those politics and policies? How do you work with the institutions? How do you get your people to work in those institutions and so on? And this is a learning curve that in some cases might actually create a backlash. And I think when you talked about about the different divisions, I don't remember a period when we didn't, as think tankers or commentators, talk about the EU being divided on a lot of different issues. I don't remember a period when the EU wasn't divided.
Oh, the EU has been in crisis since before I had facial hair.
There you go. But I think the dividing line doesn't run on the Elbe. It's not the East-West. I think the dividing line is between those who see the EU as part of the solution and those who see it as part of the problem.
Well, I think that's very true, that there is, within societies, there is much of this dividing line. But I think I would underline what Jana is saying on, from what I can see, a kind of strategic convergence also between East and West. And I think the war and the response to the war is a clear example, and was also a moment of political emancipation to some extent for Central and Eastern Europe, a moment where leaders of Poland, Baltic states and others could say with some justice, we told you so. We told you about Putin. We told you about the risks of gas dependence.
Yes, because their concerns were patronized in Brussels about Russia.
Yes, indeed. So that there was, and I think that has been recognized at the highest levels, perhaps more explicitly by the French than by the Germans, but nevertheless, that has been recognized.
I do think it was a very unique thing for a French president to say, I was wrong.
And he said it in Slovakia, in Bratislava, next door, in a speech worth rereading late May. So that's an important shift. I also see coming the other way the president of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, touring the EU or addressing European audiences, the European Parliament, the College of Europe in Bruges, with a message which is European in a way. And I think there is convergence there, which no doubt will help.
Well, my only concern is, I mean, how long can, it's not always the fault of the Central and Eastern Europeans that they don't recognize themselves in Brussels. Sometimes there are very few senior figures in any position of responsibility from the region. You know, there's no doubt about it, the center of politics is more to the right in Central and Eastern Europe, and we're not even going to get on to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. But, you know, for me at least, I hope this generational shift is going to happen soon, because we really need, you know, we need our generation, sounds so pretentious, to engage with the Brussels institutions. Don't leave them empty. This is it's a real risk. We're coming a little bit towards the end, so I want to jump in and be really unfair with you both and talk about migration. Migration, huge issue in the election just happened in your country, huge issue in the collapse of the Dutch government. It killed the career of Mark Rutte after 13 years as Dutch Prime Minister. Huge issue in the upcoming Polish election this Sunday. Would you like to just maybe, for the audience, give your own perspective on migration? You are a foreign policy analyst, fundamentally. You are a political philosopher. Migration is not the thing you think about every day. But it's coming up in a way it can't be ignored. Maybe could I get a reaction from you, for example, in how it came to dominate Slovak politics very quickly?
Yes, but I feel uncomfortable in doing it in presence of you because you've forgotten about migration more than I will ever know. But I will just try to say something.
I'm actually an imposter.
Yes, it's an issue that has not been as present in Slovakia or in our region for a long time, and the reason why it has become so salient is for two reasons. I'll start with facts, and then I start with context. The fact is we have seen a more than 1,000% rise in illegal migration going through Slovakia. Most of that is transition. Slovakia is not a target country. But it's people that have started to cross the border that we have with Hungary, especially primarily from Hungary, and continuing onward mostly to Germany. So that is the fact. It's the rise that hasn't been there before. It's visible. It's something that's noticed in the media and so on. The context, of course, is that this is happening at the time of an election campaign, which unsurprisingly, as in a number of other countries, some politicians think the best thing how to win elections is to play on people's fears. And this is what has happened. But I think what it points out to fundamentally is, and this is a realization that is maybe coming a bit later to our region compared to countries such as the Netherlands and others, that we really need to work on a European solution. And it might sound as a boilerplate now, but it brought home something which a number of countries, including Italy, Spain, and others, have been talking about and pushed for a long time. They always have not met with a good response and understanding in our part of the world, and this is something that has, I would hope, also fundamentally changed the view on migration in this part of the European Union, with the realization that there is no simple national solution to migration. We really need to come up with a solution that works for everyone, and just saying no is not going to get us closer to that solution.
But so the Ukrainian issue, there was no Ukrainian fatigue, for example, of the fact that there were already a large amount of Ukrainians in the country, and they will obviously use resources and accommodation spaces and all of that.
I think that might have an impact more on the kind of crisis management part. Last year, when Russia started its full-scale invasion, Slovakia is a country of 5 million people. In a space of a couple of months, more than 1 million people crossed the border from Ukraine to Slovakia. Many of them continued forward, but it was a pressure on our system and on our crisis management structures. So in a way that has affected the response on our side this year, when we have the rise in migration coming through the Balkans route. But it hasn't been an issue. The issue of Ukrainians in Slovakia has not been an issue. If anything, there was an issue of military aid to Ukraine, but that's very different from migration.
Luuk?
Well, I think in the case of the Netherlands, it's true, as Jana also suggests, the issues of migration and integration of migrant communities has been very present for at least 20 years and has fueled, as in many other countries, the rise of nationalist and extremist movement. Paradoxically, it's not so much currently part of the upcoming election campaign, but it is, I would say, very significant that the government fell over the issue of asylum policy nevertheless. Because as you said, Hugo, this is Mark Rutte, Dutch Prime Minister for 13 years, praised all over Europe as a master of compromise making. He was in his fourth government, he has government the extreme right, with the center, with Labour, so he could pull any rabbit out of his head, and it was on migration and asylum in particular that his government fell. And I think that tells us something about one of the themes of this whole conference, the difficulty to find compromises in the center even on these issues, because they are so divisive. And then I'm going to zoom in very briefly. So what was this government? It was a four-party coalition, centrist. Two of them progressive Christian and liberal, and two more conservative, including Rutte's own liberals. So the progressives, let's say, they wanted a maximum of charity, fundamental rights, etc., which is a well-represented view in many, many societies. And the center-right two parties, conservatives and Christian Democrats, they were more embodying the language of border control, security, concerns of our own people first. So there's this tension, which normally one should be able to overcome. And yet the government fell over it, which shows how difficult it has become, this shrinking space of policy making, and which is also why it's so important, the work you are doing, Mr. Spindelega and others here with ICMPD, to keep that space for fact-based, strategic, forward-looking policy making on migration. Because at the end of the day, and I'll finish there, and there I think the Dutch case is also revealing of a wider trend. There are no democratic majorities for open border policies anywhere. People will stop it. But at the same time, there are very strong and motivated, more or less minorities, but also civil society movements, to have a maximum of charity with all the suffering, or a lot of the suffering, from the rest of the world. So this is going to be with us, and this is why the work you are doing is so important, and it's one reason I'm very happy to be here today.
And we're really very happy that the Netherlands chose to become an ICMPD member state this year as well. So I think for people who would describe themselves as progressive, there's a great question, which is, we all know that we will need huge amounts of labour migration to Europe, but we don't know how to sell it to the public. And because no politician in history has gotten up on a stage and said, if I'm elected, I will bring 400,000 people a year into this country, for example, as the Germans are planning to do, as even the French are planning to do, as the Italians are planning to do. So this is a major theme that Michael, our Director General, has set out for this conference, is the space for policymakers getting narrower and narrower through polarization, so that we can't maneuver. And then in the end, even the protection system will become a victim. We are coming to the end, and I want to remain on time because we're in Austria, and I have learned the value of punctuality living in Austria. But I'd like to come back to enlargement just for one last moment, and I wanted to ask you just for a very last, your feeling, nobody can predict the future, okay, your feeling, will the enlargement process before us, and I apologize to our colleagues from the Western Balkan countries that we haven't been able to discuss that region more today. That's not intentional, it's just the Ukraine decision is looming so large so quickly. Do you feel that in the end enlargement will remain merit-based, or will the geopolitical imperative override certain things?
The geopolitical imperative will become more important in the current context, and I think the decision to grant candidate status to Ukraine was the proof of it. It was a war-driven decision, and there may be others like that. Mm-hmm. And there will be battles around it, but let's say the balance between these two considerations is clearly more now towards the strategic necessity of having these countries within the space of the European Union, and then, of course, I should add, without lowering the bar too much on some of the other issues, including the elephant in the room.
Jana, what?
Yeah, I think the geopolitical imperative was what prompted the current wave. I think it would be short-sighted also because of the reasons we discussed if we let it drive the agenda in the future. I think the merit base should be there, not because it's a good thing to do, it's something that also helps us prevent some of the scenarios from repeating when it comes to rule of law and other issues. So the closer we get to the potential accession, I think there is going to be and should be more focus on the merit-based.
I was going to close this session by quoting the great Italian political philosopher and Euro-communist Gramsci, who talked about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And I thought I would be able to say, and here we have the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, but it turns out we just have both the optimism of the will. So on that note, I'd like to thank you both so much for coming and joining us, and thank you, the audience, for listening so patiently. And I'm sorry there wasn't time for questions, but you can grab these guys afterwards in the reception.
Thanks.